The worst thing to lose is wisdom. A Buddhist story on true loss and real gain. It was the sound of sobbing that struck me first. Not loud, not hysterical, just this quiet, trembling weeping. The kind that seeps into your bones more than your ears. It was coming from a small corner of the hall, where an old woman sat with her face buried in her scarf, rocking slowly like a tree swaying in a storm. We were at a funeral. My uncle had passed away, a man I barely knew. He lived in another city, visited only once a year, but he always brought sweets for the kids and smiled like he had no problems in the world. Death has a strange way of making you pause. It silences all the noise that normally fills your day, the buzzing phones, the chores, the nagging worries, and replaces it with a hollow kind of stillness. I stood by the window, watching people drift in and out of the hall like shadows, some clutching flowers, others whispering memories. And then I heard someone say, "It's such a big loss, a real tragedy." That word, loss, stuck with me. What does it mean to lose someone? I looked over at my cousin, his son. His face looked carved from stone. Not a single tear, but his hands trembled when he picked up his father's photograph. Beside him, my aunt stared blankly at the altar, as though her soul had floated somewhere else. That evening, as the candles flickered and incense curled toward the ceiling, I sat in a corner with my thoughts, trying to make sense of it all. I remembered a sermon I'd heard years ago, one that didn't feel important back then. A monk in saffron robes had said something I couldn't forget. The loss of relatives is painful, yes, but it is not the worst loss. The worst loss is the loss of wisdom. At the time, I had scoffed. How could losing a person not be the worst thing? But now, sitting among grieving faces, watching the way pain clung to people like an invisible fog, I started to wonder, was the monk right? Wisdom, what is it, really? It's not just knowing facts or being clever. Wisdom is something else. It's the ability to see clearly, especially when the world goes dark. When I was younger, my grandmother used to tell me stories about people who made foolish choices, not because they were bad people, but because they didn't understand what truly mattered. They chased after things that sparkled but crumbled in their hands: money, fame, approval, and they ignored the simple truths that could have saved them. I used to roll my eyes at those stories, but now, here at a funeral, I realized I didn't even know what I had been chasing. I'd been living on autopilot, chasing promotions, likes on social media, weekend thrills, and suddenly, all that felt insignificant. After the ceremony, I approached the monk who had chanted the final prayers. He was old, with a face full of wrinkles that somehow looked peaceful rather than tired. I asked him, "Venerable sir, how can you say that losing a person isn't the greatest loss?" He smiled gently, as if he'd been asked this question 1,000 times. Because he said, "We all come to this world alone, and we leave it alone. Losing someone hurts, of course it does. But if in that pain you lose your understanding, if you lose your ability to see the truth, that is the real tragedy." He paused and added softly, "What you feel now is grief, and that is natural. But wisdom teaches you how to carry that grief, instead of letting it crush you." His words stayed with me for days. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept going back to what he said. If you lose wisdom, you lose everything. I thought about how we're taught to mourn when we lose loved ones, how we panic when we lose wealth or status, but rarely do we even notice when we lose clarity, when we stop thinking, when we give in to ignorance. How many times had I chased revenge instead of forgiveness? How many times had I chosen distraction over reflection? How often had I heard the teachings of the Buddha and nodded but never truly listened? I remembered another phrase from the discourse the monk had quoted: "Insignificant, because, is the loss of relatives. The worst thing to lose is wisdom." And, for the first time in my life, I believed it. The next morning, I went to the temple alone. I didn't go to pray or offer flowers or light incense. I went to sit, just sit, in silence, with the scent of jasmine in the air and the sound of birds in the distance. I closed my eyes and breathed. And for the first time in weeks, I wasn't running from anything. I wasn't blaming or planning or regretting. I just was. In that stillness, something shifted. A little door inside me creaked open. I felt my grief, but it wasn't choking me anymore. I felt sadness, but it was no longer heavy. It was just there, real, raw, and bearable. When I opened my eyes, an old nun was sitting nearby. She looked at me and said, "It's good that you came." I smiled weakly and asked, "Do you think He's in a better place now. My uncle. She looked at me kindly. That depends, she said. Not on how much he was loved, but on what he knew, on what wisdom he cultivated before he passed. I had never thought of death that way. I always assumed our fate was about luck or divine judgment. But she was right. Just like a farmer can't harvest rice if he planted weeds, our future, this life and the next, is shaped by how we see, what we choose, and what we understand. As days passed, I began reading the numerical discourses of the Buddha, starting with the one the monk had quoted. Every night before bed, I read a passage not to memorize, but to reflect. The more I read, the more I realized how much time I had wasted crying over things that, in the eyes of the Dhamma, were insignificant. Yes, losing loved ones is painful. Yes, losing money is painful. Yes, losing status is painful. But none of those losses blind you. Only ignorance does that. When you lose wisdom, you don't even realize what you've lost. That's what makes it so dangerous. It slips away quietly, like a thief in the night, taking your clarity, your peace, your purpose. So I made a vow, not just to mourn less, but to understand more, to practice mindfulness, not just when it's easy, but especially when it's hard. To develop wisdom not for pride or status, but so that I can live and die without regrets. I realized that the most powerful thing we can do in this human life is not to cling, not to grieve endlessly, but to wake up and see things as they truly are. And that was the beginning of everything. Do you remember the first time you saw someone completely break down? I do. It wasn't a movie scene or a dramatic argument. It was something quieter, something that hit harder because it wasn't loud. It was a man sitting on the pavement in front of a burned-down shop. I didn't know him. I didn't know what he'd lost, but I was there that day, passing by on my way home from work. Flames had devoured his small convenience store the night before, and the charred remains still smoked slightly in the morning air. He was staring at what used to be his life. His hands hung limp at his sides. His eyes looked hollow, as though whatever once filled them had been drained overnight. People walked past, whispering, pitying, but nobody stopped. I did. I knelt beside him and asked gently, "Do you want some water?" He didn't answer. After a long pause, he said in a whisper that barely escaped his lips, "That was everything I had. Everything." I wanted to say something helpful, something wise, but I couldn't. What comfort could words offer when a man had just lost the only thing keeping his family afloat? I just sat with him, and I remembered again the words of the Buddha, "Insignificant, biggest, is the loss of wealth. The worst thing to lose is wisdom." But tell me honestly, have you ever treated money like it was your lifeline? I have. When my savings dropped below a certain number, my heart raced. When my friend bought a nicer car, I felt an ugly envy bloom inside me. When I got passed over for a raise at work, I spent weeks stewing in bitterness. I thought wealth meant security. I thought losing it meant disaster. But that man taught me something without saying much. He sat in silence, and then he said one sentence that I'll never forget. "I wish I'd learned how to live without needing all this." He wasn't talking about living in poverty. He wasn't saying we should never earn or build something. He was saying that when your entire identity is built around what you own, then when you lose it, you lose yourself. The next day I went back to the temple. This time, I brought my journal. With me, I wrote in big letters, "What am I afraid to lose?" And under that, I listed my family, my health, my money, my reputation, my status, my confidence, my youth. Then, beneath it, I added a single line the monk had taught me to reflect on. "All of these will pass. One day, I will lose every single thing on that list. Not because I'm unlucky, not because I did something wrong, but because that's the nature of life." Then, I wrote another question beneath it. "What will I have left?" That one was harder to answer. I thought about it all day. A few days later, I visited a family friend who was bedridden with late-stage cancer. She used to be a high-powered businesswoman, always dressed sharp, phone glued to her hand, commanding boardrooms with her voice. Now her voice was barely above a whisper, but her eyes had more clarity than I'd ever seen before. She looked at me and said, "You know what hurts the most? Not the illness, not even the thought of dying. It's that I spent 40 years running after things that don't follow me to this bed." She smiled faintly. "I wish I'd studied the Dhamma. Earlier, I used to think wisdom was for monks, for old people, for those who had time to waste. But now, it's the only thing that matters. Because when everything else is stripped away, what's left is how clearly you understand what's happening to you. We sat in silence for a while. Then she asked me a question I hadn't expected. What are you doing to train your mind? I blinked. I was about to say I meditate sometimes, or I read when I have time. But I stopped myself, because the truth was I wasn't training it at all. I was letting it drift, letting it get swayed by social media, opinions, distractions, letting it panic at the smallest setback, letting it believe that happiness was out there, somewhere, waiting to be bought or earned. I left her house that day shaken, not because she was dying, but because I was still asleep. That night, I went home and sat quietly in my room. No music, no phone, just silence. And I started asking myself some hard questions. What do I think makes a life successful? What do I believe I need to be happy? What do I fear losing most? And then I added, if I lost all those things, would I still have peace? The answer was no. Not because peace is impossible, but because I hadn't learned how to cultivate it. From within, I remembered something else the Buddha said. The one who has developed wisdom, even when stripped of all worldly things, walks with peace. That became my new goal. Not to be unshakable like a rock, but to be clear, like still water, able to reflect reality, not distort it. One day at the temple, I spoke to the same monk again. I asked him, why is the loss of wisdom worse than the loss of wealth? He said, because wealth can be earned again. Even health can return. Reputation can be rebuilt. But if you lose your wisdom, you lose the compass that helps you make all the right choices. You won't even know what matters anymore. He looked at me and added softly, a man with money and no wisdom is like a ship full of gold, sailing blind into a storm. That image shook me. I didn't want to be that ship. I began studying more seriously after that. Each evening, I read the Buddha's words not as scripture, but as a conversation with someone who sees deeper than I do. I started waking up earlier to sit in meditation. Some days my mind was wild, like a monkey in a cage. But slowly, I noticed stillness began to visit me like an old friend. When I got angry, I noticed the anger instead of reacting. When I felt desire rise up, I saw how it tricked me into believing I needed more to feel whole. And when sadness crept in, I didn't chase it. Away sat beside it, like a quiet companion. This wasn't magic. This was wisdom growing, tiny seed by seed. A month later, I got news that my company was laying off people due to restructuring. I was one of them. The old me would have panicked, but this time, I didn't cry. I didn't lash out. I sat down and I said to myself, this too is impermanent. What remains is how I respond. And for the first time in my life, I truly saw what the Buddha meant when he said, the loss of wealth is insignificant. The worst thing to lose is wisdom. Because with wisdom, even loss can be a teacher. Even pain can lead to freedom. I'm not saying I became a monk. I'm not saying I reached enlightenment. But I started walking, not toward success, not toward more stuff, but toward clarity, toward peace. And I've never looked back. Fame is a strange thing. It wraps itself around you like a warm blanket, at first soothing, exciting, addictive. You start to believe in the echoes of your own name. People look at you, talk about you, praise you, and you think, this is it. I've made it. But the thing about applause is, it eventually stops, and the silence it leaves behind, that silence can be deafening. I used to know a man named Ravi. He wasn't a movie star or a billionaire. He was a local news anchor, but in our small city, his face was everywhere. On bus stops, on billboards, on TV screens, in every shop and waiting room, people loved him. His voice was smooth, confident. He always seemed to know what to say, when to smile, how to look just the right amount of sincere. Kids asked for selfies. Adults nodded respectfully when he walked by. Strangers sent him gifts during the holidays. That he once told me, it feels like I matter. But one year, the network hired someone younger, fresher, louder, hungrier. Suddenly, Ravi's airtime was cut. His photo was replaced. Invitations stopped coming. No scandal, no drama, just fading. And Ravi, he didn't take it well. I ran into him a few months later. He looked thinner. His clothes hung loose on him. He didn't smile like he used to. We sat down at a cafe, and after a long silence, he said, you know what's funny? I thought people loved me. Turns out, they loved the idea of me. He stirred his coffee slowly. Then he said something I'll never forget. When the lights go out, you find out who you really are, and I don't know who I am anymore. That evening, I went home and opened my Dhamma journal. I flipped to a page where I had copied one of the Buddha's teachings. Insignificant because is the loss of fame. The worst thing to lose is wisdom. At the time I wrote it, I didn't fully grasp it, but now I could see. Fame is like a flower. It blooms beautifully, then withers quickly. But wisdom is like a root. It anchors you, holds you steady even when the winds of life strip away every leaf and petal. Ravi didn't understand that yet. He tried to claw his way back, started a YouTube channel, posted flashy videos, gave hot takes on controversial topics, but his eyes looked tired. He wasn't trying to express something anymore. He was trying to be seen, just seen. One day, I sent him a message. Would you like to come to the temple with me this weekend? I think it might help. He replied with just one word, maybe. That Sunday, to my surprise, he showed up. He wore sunglasses, maybe to hide from the few people who might still recognize him. We sat through a sermon by a young monk who spoke gently, simply. He told the story of a man who lost his palace, his power, his people, and thought he had lost everything. But then the man met the Buddha, and the Buddha said, "You have not lost everything. You have simply lost your distractions. Now, you have the space to see." The sermon, Ravi sat quietly for a long time. When we finally stood to leave, he said, "That story was about me, wasn't it?" We started visiting the temple together once a week. Ravi didn't become a saint overnight. He still missed the spotlight. He still had moments of bitterness, but something softened in him. He started listening more, then talking. He started asking questions that weren't about branding or strategy, but about purpose. He asked the monk once, "Why does fame feel so good when it's here, and so awful when it's gone?" The monk smiled and said, "Because it's not real. It's like mist. You can see it, but try to hold it in your hands, and it slips away." Then he added, "Wisdom is different. It doesn't need an audience." I thought a lot about that. How many of us are performing every day? Not just actors or influencers, but regular people. We smile for the camera. We post filtered photos. We hide our struggles behind curated lives. We seek approval like it's oxygen. But when the show ends, when no one's clapping, no one's watching, who are we then? That question haunted me. It made me realize how often I'd shaped myself based on what others thought of me. How often I'd let fear of judgment stop me from doing the right thing. How much of my energy I had spent trying to be liked, instead of trying to be wise. One day, Ravi told me he was moving away. He'd been offered a quiet job at a media school in a small town training young reporters, away from the cameras. He said, "I think it's time I learned to be useful without needing to be seen." I smiled and said, "That's the most beautiful thing you've ever said." As he packed up his apartment, he handed me a notebook. Inside were pages filled with reflections, quotes from the Buddha, thoughts after meditation, even a few poems. On the last page he wrote, "I lost my fame, then I lost my shame, then I found peace." I sat in the temple that evening, watching the sun dip behind the trees, and I realized the world will always measure us by what we show, but the Dharma measures us by what we understand, and understanding, true, deep, heart-changing understanding, can only come through wisdom. Fame fades, but clarity can shine through even the darkest night. They say grief is the price we pay for love, and it's true. When you've truly loved someone, their absence becomes a kind of presence, a shadow that walks beside you, a silence that echoes louder than sound. But the Buddha said something far more unsettling. The tears you've shed in some sorrow, wandering through lifetimes, are more than the water in the four great oceans. Let that sink in. More than all the oceans in the world. That's not poetry. That's reality. I remember the first time I truly cried for someone. It was when my younger sister died. She was 12. I was 19. It was dengue. One week she was playing in the yard, chasing butterflies, giggling about cartoons. The next week, she was in a hospital bed, her tiny hands wrapped in 4 tubes, her breath shallow. I was there when the machines stopped beeping. And then, silence. A silence I'll never forget. For weeks, I couldn't speak, couldn't smile, couldn't eat properly. People tried to comfort me. She's in a better place. God takes the good ones early. Time heals everything. But nothing helped. Because I wasn't just sad. I was angry. Angry at the doctors. Angry at fate. Angry at the world. even angry at myself for not being able to do something, anything. I didn't go to the temple. I didn't chant. I didn't meditate. I didn't want peace. I wanted her back. One day, my mother, who hadn't cried once since the funeral, came to my room. She placed something on my table. It was a thin book, worn cover, gold letters, the numerical discourses of the Buddha. I looked at her, confused. She said, "I read a passage today that made me understand, at least a little. Maybe it will help you too." And then she left. I didn't touch the book for 3 days, but on the 4th night, unable to sleep, I opened it, and I found the sutta that changed my life. The Buddha said, "Insignificant. Because is the loss of relatives. The worst thing to lose is wisdom." I stared at those words. Insignificant. How could he say that? Didn't he know what it felt like? Didn't he understand the pain of losing a sibling? I slammed the book shut, but I couldn't shake those words. Insignificant. The next day, I went to the temple not to pray, not to listen, but to argue. The monk there, an elderly, quiet man named Venerable Anando, welcomed me with a smile. I didn't even greet him properly. I said, "Is it true that the Buddha said losing a loved one is insignificant?" He nodded gently. I was furious. Do you know how that feels? How can he say that? Losing a child, a sister, a parent, how can that be nothing? He didn't flinch. He said, "My dear one, it's not that it doesn't matter. It's that it's not the worst thing." He paused. "Tell me your grief. How long has it lasted?" I choked. 2 months. "And before that, had you ever lost someone else?" "Yes," I said, "my grandfather, years ago." "And when you were born, did you bring anyone with you?" I didn't answer. He leaned closer. His voice was like wind through bamboo. "We come alone. We leave alone. Everyone we meet, every hand we hold, every eye we look into, is a passing boat. Some sail with us for moments, some for years, but all must part. That is the way of samsara," he continued. "You are crying now for your sister, but how many sisters have you had in previous lives? How many brothers, mothers, fathers, friends, lovers?" He pointed to the horizon. "The Buddha said the tears you've shed for them would fill more than all the oceans. Yet we do not remember their names." I felt something inside me tremble, not from pain but from realization. All my grief, real, heavy, endless, was just a drop in the sea of suffering I'd carried for lifetimes. The monk gave me tea, and he said, "But this is not hopeless. There is something that does not vanish with time, something that travels with you through birth, death, and beyond." I looked at him. He smiled. "Wisdom. Wisdom doesn't erase grief, but it transforms it. Instead of screaming, 'Why me?' wisdom whispers, 'This too is a lesson.' Instead of clinging, it teaches letting go. Instead of collapsing, it helps you sit still with the pain, with the love, with the truth. Wisdom is not the absence of tears, it's the presence of understanding." In the months that followed, I started meditating again. I visited my sister's grave not to ask for her return, but to say thank you. Thank you for being a part of my journey. Thank you for teaching me how deeply humans can love, and thank you for pointing me back to the path I'd left behind. Because her loss was real, but the worst thing would have been to let that loss consume me, blind me, break me permanently. The Buddha was right. The loss of loved ones is a sorrow of this life, but the loss of wisdom dooms us in the next. I've cried less since then, not because I'm cold, but because I understand. I still miss her. I still see her in dreams, but I've stopped asking, "Why did this happen to me?" Instead, I ask, "What can I learn from this?" And that one change in mindset, that one shift has changed everything. There is a kind of fire that doesn't just burn down buildings, that it burns through your beliefs, your illusions, your imagined safety. And when it's done, you're left with ashes and the uncomfortable question, who am I, now that everything is gone? I met Kamala after the fire. She was sitting outside what used to be her home, a small wooden house tucked behind the rice paddies near the temple. It had stood for 3 generations. Her father was born there. Her mother died there. And now, it was gone. Blackened beams, twisted metal, the sweet scent of smoke lingering like a ghost. She sat on a plastic chair, barefoot, knees hugged to her chest. I brought her water. She nodded but didn't speak. Only after a long silence did she whisper. It didn't even give me time to say goodbye. I sat beside her. Sometimes, silence is the only answer you can give. But I remembered the teachings, and I remembered what loss feels like when it's fresh like skin peeled back, nerves exposed. So I didn't offer comfort, I offered presence. Later, when she spoke again, her voice cracked like dry leaves. I didn't just lose things, I lost memories, my baby's first drawings, my mother's shawl, the letter my husband wrote before he passed. She looked at her hands. I feel like my past was erased. I swallowed the lump in my throat, because I knew that feeling. That evening, I returned to the temple and asked the abbot a question that had been burning in me all day. How do we accept losing everything we thought was permanent? He looked at me, eyes gentle, and said, by understanding that nothing ever was. The next day, I brought Kamala a small book of Dhamma teachings. She looked at it and smiled faintly. I used to read things like this before life got too busy. I nodded. Maybe now's the time to come back. She came with me to the temple a week later. She didn't chant, she didn't kneel. She just sat in the back, eyes closed, breathing with the rhythm of a woman who had nothing left to lose, but something was happening inside her. I could feel it. The sermon that day was from the Anguttara Nikaya. The monk read aloud, "Insignificant is the loss of wealth. The worst thing to lose is wisdom." He looked up and said, "Why does the Buddha say this?" Because the loss of wealth only affects this life, but the loss of wisdom follows us into the next. Kamala didn't react outwardly, but later, she said to me, "I always thought my house was my root, but now I sit was just a leaf." She began coming every week, to pray for a new house, not to complain, but to listen, to watch, to let the Dhamma seep into the cracks the fire had left behind. She told me once, "I thought I was empty after the fire, but now, it feels like I've been cleared out for something new." One day, I asked her, "What helped you most?" She smiled, understanding that clinging to what was is the real suffering, not the fire. The fire was just nature, but my attachment, that was the real pain. She looked at me and said something I've never forgotten. "The flames didn't take my peace, my expectations did." I started writing down these moments, because I realized something. Every time we lose something, money, family, love, comfort, we stand at a fork in the road. One path leads to bitterness, resentment, endless questioning. The other leads to awakening, not because the loss was good, but because the understanding born from it was precious. That's why the Buddha said, the worst thing to lose is wisdom, because without it, even a small fire can destroy your whole life, but with it, even the biggest disaster can become your teacher. Kamala rebuilt eventually, but not just the house. She rebuilt her heart, her priorities, her view of life. Her new home had a small shrine in the corner. On it stood a simple statue of the Buddha, a candle, and a line she wrote in gold ink. "May wisdom rise from every ruin." That line has stayed with me, because it reminds me that life is not about avoiding loss. It's about meeting it with eyes wide open. It's about using every shattered plan, every broken dream, every burned down house as a mirror to see what truly lasts. And what truly lasts is not the home, or the wealth, or the image. What lasts is the clarity you carry. We all know someone like Arun, the life of the party, the one who always has a joke, a drink in hand, a plan for the weekend. He used to say, "Life is for living, not for overthinking." And I used to admire him for that, his spontaneity, his confidence, the way he laughed, like the world could never touch him. But I didn't know back then how thin the surface of a man could be, how much pain a smile could hide, and how fast a mind could fall when it no longer knew what to hold on to. Arun's fall wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some overdose or a breakdown in public. It was quiet, subtle. It started with a failed business deal. Then his wife left. Then his drinking grew heavier. And then one day, I visited him and found him sitting in the dark, curtains drawn, bottles on the table, TV, muted eyes staring at something far beyond the walls. He looked at me blankly and said, "I don't know what's real anymore." I tried to help. I called old friends. I brought him food. I sat with him through nights when he couldn't sleep. But nothing worked, because what he had lost wasn't just his career, or his marriage, or his money. What he had lost was his grip on reality, his trust in life, his faith in himself. He had lost the only compass that can guide us through suffering. He had lost wisdom. One night, when I came to check on him, I found the door open. I ran inside, heart racing. He was standing on the balcony. The look in his eyes terrified me, not because he was angry or sad, but because they looked empty, like no one was home. I whispered his name, Arun. He turned, slowly, and he said, "Do you think it matters if I disappear?" I didn't answer right away. I walked toward him gently, and I said, "Yes, because your suffering isn't meaningless. It's trying to teach you something." He looked at me, confused. I said it again. Suffering is a teacher. It's not the enemy, but you have to listen. I brought him to the temple the next morning. He didn't want to go, but he was too tired to argue. We sat in the back during the morning chant. The monk spoke about the fire. Sermon how the world is burning with desire, with hatred, with delusion, and how the Buddha taught us to see the fire, not run from it, not drown in it, but see it clearly, and be free. After the sermon, Arun asked me, "What does that even mean?" I said, "It means you're not crazy. The world is on fire. But if you understand that, you don't have to burn." We began small. I brought him a passage every day, just one. We read it aloud together, then sat in silence. Some days he cried, some days he was angry, some days he just stared, but he stayed. And slowly, the fog began to lift. He asked me once, "Do you think I've gone mad?" I said, "No, I think you're waking up after a long, long dream." He nodded, and then he whispered, "I thought losing my wife was the worst thing. Then I thought losing my job was, but it wasn't. It was losing myself." I told him what the Buddha said. Insignificant is the loss of relationships. Insignificant is the loss of wealth. But the loss of wisdom is the greatest loss. One day, Arun didn't come to the temple. I was worried. I went to his place and knocked. He opened the door, smiling. "Sorry," he said. "I was meditating." My mouth dropped open. He laughed. "I'm not good at it. My mind's still loud, but it's the first time I've felt like I belonged inside myself again." That sentence, "belonged inside myself," still gives me goosebumps, because most of us are strangers to ourselves, running from mirror to mirror, hoping one will reflect something we like. But Arun was starting to see clearly. Months passed. He got a simple job, started cooking his own meals, smiled more, but most importantly, he stopped chasing noise. One evening, we sat at the edge of the temple pond, watching the moon ripple in the water. He said, "You saved me." I shook my head. "No, the Dhamma did. I just showed you where to look." He leaned back and sighed. "Funny, huh? I used to think wisdom was boring, just a bunch of monks in robes chanting." I smiled. "And now," he looked at the stars, "now I know it's the only thing that's real." So many people lose their minds, not because they're weak, but because they don't know what to hold on to when life collapses. They grab at pleasure, or numb themselves with distractions, or scream into the void. But the Buddha gave us something else. He gave us wisdom, not to escape the storm, but to understand it, to see how it rises, how it passes, to know that pain is not punishment, and peace is not hiding. Peace is seeing. Have you ever seen a man with everything slowly fall apart? Not all at once, not in a scandal or a sudden crash, but in slow motion, like a golden statue left in the rain, shining on the outside, but crumbling underneath. That was Mr. Devendra, or, as people in town called him, the Golden Man. He owned half the buildings on Main Street. His name was on donation plaques in every hospital wing, every school hallway. He drove cars so expensive we didn't know how to pronounce their names. He wore suits that looked hand-stitched by angels. But you know the funny thing? He never smiled. Not once, not a genuine smile. Even in his success, he carried a look of worry, like he was waiting for something terrible to happen. Maybe he was, because when it finally did, he had no tools to face it. It started with the economy, crashing. Then his factories flooded during a storm. Then a lawsuit dragged him through courts for years. And then, the final blow. His only son died in a car accident racing down the highway in one of those expensive machines. Music blasting, life spilling out too fast. That's when Devendra disappeared. Not literally. He still showed up in public, wore the same suits, nodded at the same events, but he wasn't there anymore. He became hollow, like a temple where no one chants. I ran into him at a hospital once. I was visiting an old teacher. He was sitting alone in the waiting area. We nodded politely, but then something strange happened. He leaned over and quietly asked, "Do you believe any of this matters?" I looked at him, surprised. He said, "All this money, these buildings, the land, the fame. Do you think it helps when your son is lying, cold in a steel box?" His voice cracked. "Do you think it can hug you when you cry at night?" I didn't know what to say. He continued, "Everyone thought I was lucky. but I never knew how to live. I only knew how to own things. Then he looked at me with tear-filled eyes and whispered, I would trade every single rupee I've earned just to feel peace for one day. That sentence broke me, because it echoed exactly what the Buddha taught. Insignificant is the loss of wealth. The worst thing to lose is wisdom. I invited him to the temple. He laughed bitterly. I built one, he said, paid for the whole shrine hall, but never once sat down to listen. I said, maybe now's the time, and to my surprise, he agreed. He came in quietly the following Sunday, no assistance, no gold rings, just simple clothes and tired eyes. He sat in the back, arms folded. The monk that day shared a sutta about blindness. He said, the truly blind are not those who cannot see with their eyes. The truly blind are those who see only gold and glitter, never the truth. At the end, Devendra didn't move. He sat long after the sermon ended. When I finally approached him, he whispered, that sermon, it was about me. Over the next few months, he kept coming. Not every week, not regularly, but enough. For the walls to crack. Enough for the mask to slip. Enough for the light to enter. He told me once, I used to think I had to protect everything I had. Lock it up, guard it, grow it. But the only thing I should have protected was my own heart. He began asking real questions, not about investment or influence, but about imprama, M-A-N-E-N-C-E, karma, compassion, wisdom. He confessed, I feel like I've wasted my life. The monk responded, then make this moment the beginning, not the end. One day, Devendra made an announcement that shocked the entire city. He was giving up half his wealth not to impress anyone, but to create centers for learning the Dhamma. Didn't want his name on them. He said, let the teachings shine, not me. At the opening of the first center, he stood silently, then simply said, I spent 50 years building an empire. It took losing everything to build my soul. You see, when a poor man suffers, we pity him, but when a rich man suffers, we often think he must be doing something wrong. What we forget is this: suffering doesn't check your bank account before it knocks on your door. Loss comes for us all, but only wisdom shows us what loss really is. Wealth, fame, power, they're all sandcas, beautiful, impressive, but one tide, one wind, one wave and they vanish. Devendra told me once, my wealth didn't betray me. I just mistook it for something it never was. I thought it was security, meaning, love, but it was just a tool. He paused, then added, wisdom is the only true shelter, because it teaches you how to let go without breaking. That line still rings in my heart. So many of us are working so hard not for survival, but for significance. But in the end, the Buddha reminds us, if we lose everything but keep our wisdom, we have not truly lost. But if we lose wisdom, even a golden palace becomes a prison. Some people are quiet storms. They don't shout, they don't demand attention, but they leave a mark so deep, it echoes through generations. My grandmother was like that. She didn't own much, just a pair of sandals, a chipped teacup, a worn shawl, and a tiny altar in the corner of her room. But what she gave me was more precious than any inheritance. She gave me wisdom, and when she died, I realized that was the one thing she carried with her into the next life. She was born in a time of lanterns and handwritten letters, a time when women weren't expected to speak much or go far, but she went deep. Every morning before the sun kissed the rooftops, she sat cross-legged in silence, eyes closed, lips moving gently. I used to peek from the doorway as a child, wondering what secrets she was whispering to the ear. One day, I asked, "What are you doing, Grandma?" She opened her eyes and said, "I'm watering the roots of my heart." I didn't understand then, but I never forgot those words. As I grew older, I noticed something strange. Whenever someone in the family was angry, she stayed calm. Whenever someone was worried, she listened. When death visited an uncle, a cousin, even her own husband, she grieved, but never broke. I once asked her, "Aren't you afraid of dying?" She smiled and said, "How can I be afraid of something that happens every day?" I frowned. "Every day?" She nodded. "Every day, the old version of me dies, the one who was attached, or angry, or proud. And every morning, a new me is born wiser." I hope it wasn't until she fell ill that I truly began to understand her. She was 9'1", her body had become fragile, but her mind was radiant. Even as pain gnawed at her bones, she never complained. When I brought her tea, she would smile and say, "Thank you for this moment. Not for the tea, not for me, for the moment." Because that's what she had trained her whole life to cherish. The now. One evening, as rain drummed softly on the rooftop, I sat beside her. She held my hand and whispered, "Do you know what the Buddha said about loss?" I nodded. "That losing wisdom is the greatest loss." She smiled. "Good, then promise me something." "What is it?" "Don't cry too much when I go, because I'm not really going anywhere. Everything I've given you, my words, my love, my practice, that's not dying. It's moving forward, through you." I couldn't help the tears that welled up, but she wiped them gently with her thin fingers. "Let your grief water the seed of wisdom." The night she passed, there were no screams, no dramatic goodbyes. She simply stopped breathing, like a candle going out, not from wind, but from the calm decision to rest. We held her funeral at the temple she used to visit as a girl. Dozens of people came, neighbors, shopkeepers, students she had taught to read, one by one. They shared stories, not about achievements or fame, but about kindness, about how she had listened when no one else would, about how she had shared rice during a famine, about how she had told a grieving mother, "Your child is now the teacher of your heart." As I watched the smoke rise from the cremation pyre, I didn't feel emptiness, I felt clarity. She hadn't left behind land or jewelry or accounts. She had left something much greater, a path, a living example, and above all, she had proven the truth of the Buddha's words. When a person dies, what follows them is not their wealth, nor their fame, but their karma and their wisdom. Later, while cleaning her room, I found her notebook. Inside were pages filled with notes, verses, and little reminders in her slanted handwriting. On one page, she had written, "Don't cry for what passes, learn from what remains." And below, "That sadhu, sadhu, sadhu." I pressed the book to my chest and whispered, "I won't forget." Today, when I sit on my own meditation cushion, I often imagine her beside me, still watering the roots of her heart, still breathing gently, still teaching, not with words, but with presence. She reminds me that wisdom doesn't need a title. It doesn't shout, it doesn't boast. It lives quietly, like sunlight on the floor. And when death comes, wisdom does not fear it, because wisdom knows, this body may die, but truth walks on. There's a story the old monks tell. A man looks into a mirror and sees not just his reflection, but all the lives he's lived. He sees himself as a king, and a beggar, a soldier, and a child, a mother giving birth, a thief being chased, an old man dying in the dust. Every face is him, every fate his own. And the mirror, that's samsara, endless cycle of birth and death, joy and sorrow, gain and loss. And what is the only thing that can break the mirror? Wisdom. I used to think life was a straight line. You're born, you grow, you work, you die. Simple. Then I began to study the Buddhist teachings, and suddenly, life became enormous. Not one story, but millions. Not one body, but endless forms, rising and falling like waves. And I realized something terrifying. I have been here before, so many times. One evening at the temple, the monk told us, "The tears you have shed in samsara, mourning lost mothers and fathers, lost sons and daughters, lost wealth and fame, those tears are more than the water in the four great oceans." I remember sitting there in silence, goosebumps on my skin. I thought of my own griefs, my sister, my friend Arun's suffering, Devendra's broken wealth, my grandmother's passing, and then I realized, none of this is new. We are all walking in circles, crying the same tears, chasing the same illusions. But then came the most important part of the monk's talk. He said, "You have wandered in this circle not because you were cursed, but because you are unaware. You have mistaken pain for punishment. You have mistaken pleasure for purpose. You have mistaken ignorance for safety." And then he said, "But now you know. And that knowing is the beginning of freedom." I sat with that idea for weeks. The idea that all my suffering wasn't some tragedy written by fate, but symptom of not seeing clearly. That not knowing was the root of all my mistakes. The arguments I started, the people I hurt, the wrong turns I took, not because I was bad, but because I was blind. And suddenly, I saw what the Buddha meant when he said, the worst thing to lose is wisdom. Because without it, you don't just suffer, you suffer without understanding why. I once met a woman who had been married 5 times, each husband worse than the last. She wasn't bitter, she wasn't broken, she was tired. When I asked her why, She kept choosing men who hurt her. She said, I didn't know any better. Not with anger, not with shame, just with a quiet acceptance of her own unawareness. And I thought to myself, how many of us are living like that, making the same choices in this life and the next because we haven't stopped to look in the mirror. Samsara is a mirror, but not a kind one. It shows you your face not as you want it to be, but as it truly is. And if you're brave enough to look, if you're willing to see the patterns, the mistakes, the clinging, then the mirror becomes a window, a way out, and that way is wisdom. I used to ask, why is this happening to me? Now, I ask, what is this trying to teach me? And that shift has changed everything, because life still brings pain, people still disappoint, things still break, but now I see the thread behind it all. I see that every moment is a chance to wake up, to stop reacting blindly, to choose the path that leads out of the circle. The monk told us one more thing that night. You are not trapped. You are simply walking in your sleep. The Buddha has given you a lamp. Light it and begin to walk with your eyes open. That sentence still makes me cry, because I spent so many years in the dark. But now I have the lamp. And even if my steps are small, they are conscious, they are mine. There's something strange about the last words of a person. They echo. They settle into your bones. They become a part of you, even if you didn't understand them fully at the time. When the Buddha lay on his final bed, between two sala trees, the world held its breath. Gods and humans gathered. Monks stood weeping. Birds stopped singing. And then he spoke. All conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive on with diligence. That was his farewell. Not grand, not poetic, just the truth and the path. I used to wonder, why would he leave us with that? Why not something comforting, something warm? But as the years passed, I realized he didn't leave us with comfort. He left us with clarity. Because comfort fades, clarity guides. When I first read those words, I was struggling with change. I had lost a job, a relationship had ended, my health wasn't great, and I kept asking, why is everything falling apart? But the Buddha didn't say, nothing will break. He said, everything does. And once I stopped fighting that truth, something unexpected happened. I became free. I began to look at life differently, not as a house to build and protect forever, but as a garden beautiful, yes, but meant to change, meant to grow, meant to wither. And that didn't make it sad. It made it precious. Because knowing that something won't last, that's what makes you love it properly. That's what makes you pay attention. That's what makes you stop wasting time. I visited a dying man once. He had cancer. He knew the end was near. He wasn't afraid. He was grateful. I've spent most of my life chasing, he said, but these final months I've spent seeing. He paused. Seeing my wife, my children, the sky, the way sunlight hits a wall, the way water sounds in a glass. I never saw them before. Then he smiled. Dying isn't the tragedy. Never. Truly living, that's the tragedy. The Buddha didn't teach us how to avoid death. He taught us how to die without fear. And more importantly, how to live without blindness, because every day is a kind of dying. The sun sets, the body changes, the people around us shift, but wisdom helps us walk through all of it with grace, with steadiness, with open eyes. As I write this, I think of all the stories I've shared with you. My sister's death, Kamala's fire, collapse, Devendra's hollow wealth, my grandmother's last breath. Each story a reminder that suffering will find us, but suffering does not have to define us. Not if we carry the lamp of wisdom. You might still be asking, what exactly is wisdom? It's not book knowledge. It's not religious rituals. It's not being perfect. Wisdom is understanding that everything changes, accepting that clinging leads to suffering, knowing that actions bear fruit, seeing that peace comes from within, not from control, and remembering again and again that the only true safety is in awakening. Before the Buddha passed, one monk was crying uncontrollably. The Blessed One turned to him and said gently, have I not taught you, Ananda, that all that arises must pass away? Why cry over what must be? That question changed my life, because I've cried over so many things. Jobs, lovers, lost dreams, my younger self. But now I ask, do these things belong to me forever? Or were they gifts, brief, beautiful, meant to be cherished and then released? The Buddha's final gift to us wasn't comfort. It was courage. Courage to face change. Courage to embrace truth. Courage to walk the Eightfold Path, even when the road is steep and the world is loud. And most of our courage to lose everything and still smile, because we haven't lost the one thing that truly matters, wisdom. So, dear listener, may you carry these stories not as just tales from another life, but as mirrors for your own. And when life asks you to let go of people, of plans, of the past, remember this: the worst thing to lose is wisdom. If you hold on to that, you haven't lost. You've begun. Sadhu. May you walk this path with open eyes and an open heart. May your wisdom grow like a flame that never flickers. And may your farewell, whenever it comes, be a silent blessing to the world.